What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and we're back for another episode of the Super Smash Brothers Platform Fighter tutorial series. In today's episode we are going to be going over the pause menu part 2, and specifically we're going to use an input to spawn our pause menu. We can do this through the character or the player controller. Really the player controller is the better place to do it here because we will be able to trigger it even if we don't have control of a character, which you may want to do because you may be in a cutscene or you may be in a stage intro and your character hasn't spawned yet. So with that said, we can come over to our game and we will be able to hit a key like the P key, and we'll pull up our pause menu that we created in the previous episode, and we will be able to select an option and actually utilize whatever option we selected. So this is going to be another fun episode. It should be pretty simple, but it will be incredibly useful and enjoyable to make. Before we hop into the pause menu, if you want to get caught up in the entire series and just check out what we're doing here in this tutorial series, you can check out how we've created our platform fighter in the Platform Fighter and Super Smash Brothers playlist, which I'll link right here in the top right corner. We have things like controlling multiple characters on one input device, a damage counter, different modes, and a lot more. Alternatively, if you don't care about that and you only care about the pause menu, that's perfectly fine. You do not have to watch the rest of the series to implement your pause menu. I recommend that you watch the previous episode that we've implemented in this series, which is the pause menu design. That is going to be utilized a lot in today's episode because we're going to be spawning that menu that we created in the previous episode. So I'll link that right here in the top right corner if you are interested. But with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. This is a code and blueprint tutorial series. We are going to be doing most of the logic in code today, and we're going to make the input in the editor. Let's start in the editor and go to Edit, Project Settings. At this point, we can go down to our inputs, and we are still using the standard input system. We are not moving to enhanced input yet. You could do so, and this will still work if you're using enhanced input. You just have to make sure you capture those inputs using that method. We can scroll down to our action mappings and add one. Call this whatever you want. You could call it start, you could call it pause game. We don't really have a start button yet, and I think we should have something like that because we may want to do more than bring up the pause menu. We may want to be able to skip cutscenes with this button if we don't want to be able to pause it during a cutscene. We may want to be able to treat it as a secondary select button, so when we press that button we can also select our character or skip through a menu faster. So I will call this just start, and we can make it whatever key we want. I recommend the P key, P for pause, on my keyboard, but really whatever key you want will work. So P it is for me. And now we have an input action that we can bind to and handle logic for. And then just a quick recap, we have our blueprints, functional BPs, widgets, menus, pause menu. And in the pause menu, we have our buttons here, and in the graph we have some logic. So once we get to the pause menu, we will be able to press the buttons and perform some behavior. So that's the widget we are going to spawn. Now if we go to our code, we could go ahead and implement our inputs in here in our setup player input component function. However, the better place to do it, like I mentioned earlier, is our base player controller, because it is more than just something a character can do. It's really the player that can do it. So if we come to the base player controller.cpp and base player controller.h, we haven't really done anything in here, but we have created them in the series. If you haven't created yours in the series for any reason, no problem. You can just create a new C++ class called base player controller, or really whatever you want to call it, and make it a child of a player controller. You'll get pretty much this exactly right off the bat, and this will be your CPP file. So very, very simple. And we're going to add our first set of functions to it today. To add a class, if you need to add your player controller, you can go in UE4 or UE5 and go to add. But first, let's go to our C++ classes section. Go into the folder you want to add it in. So just my SSB template character folder is good enough for me. Right click, new C++ class. And you can go to all classes and search for player controller, or just search in your common classes and find it here, and then go to next and type in the name. Again, we've already done this in the series, but if you haven't, you can call it base player controller and create the class. Once you've done that, we need to implement two things for today's episode, and the first one is going to be our player controller's constructor. Right now it'll be very bare bones. We still might as well go ahead and do it. So a base player controller parentheses, semicolon. Then in base player controller.cpp, we can come down here and type a base player controller, colon, a base player controller, parentheses, curly braces like that. And now we have our constructor. So this is where we can set our default values for our variables. Now let's go back to the header file, and we want to override our function that the player controller has, which captures inputs and maps it to a function that we can call. So we're going to map our start input, or our P key, or whatever it is that we're using, to the pause menu function, or to a function that is going to spawn our pause menu. So we can go down here and type virtual set up input component. This bugs me because this is a typo. This really should be with a capital U because the way it's being used as a verb here and not a noun, but ignore me. So set up input component, override. Now, unlike the character class version of this function, the set up player input component, which if we go to a character and scroll down to this function, you'll see that it takes in an input component. The player controller already has this input component that it will grab for you. So when you're overriding the function, you don't have to pass it in. So don't forget your return type, virtual void setup input component. That was silly of me. I like to comment on my functions at this point, so we'll say bind inputs to functions. And now we can go into base player controller, and we can go below our constructor, type out void a base player controller : setup input component. And in here we want to call super : setup input component, and call this, because this is our parent class call to setup input component. So it's going to do whatever is in a player controller setup input component function. Now we can bind our actions. Remember, we don't have to access a variable like we did in the character class, but we still want to use the input component that exists within the player controller. So input component, arrow, bind action. And we can bind any actions in here that we want to bind. So I'll just say bind input actions to functions. In here, we have the same list that we have in our character class. So the first thing is our binding name. So the actual input name that we have in the project settings, I name mine start. Make sure you get the name and match it exactly, case and all. This is what we added earlier in the project settings. So start is the input action that we're binding. You can see on screen here, we have the type of key event, which is press, release, that sort of thing. And then we have the object that we're going to be calling it on, the function that we're going to be calling. So next one is our key event, which we can use input event underscore pressed. So when we press the start button, we execute this logic. And then for the object, we do this because it is on this player controller that we're executing it. This is this class, this instance of this class, really. And that's what we want to execute this on. Then we have to pass it the function, and we do this by ampersand, a base player controller. And a big reason that we do that is because you can actually call functions from other classes and execute it on those objects as well. We're not doing that here, but just keep that in mind. : and then you type the name of the function, which is going to be a function we have to create called start logic or start input or something like that. It's called perform start. I think that's pretty good. So this is our function. Now we don't have this function yet. We need to make it. So if we go back to baseplayercontroller.h, we can come down here, logic that is triggered when the start input is pressed. And we'll call it void perform start. This should map properly, but we need to make the function. So void a base player controller : perform start. Then when we're in here, we can execute the logic we want to execute to create our pause menu. Actually, let's call this perform start input logic. I was trying to think of a good name for it, and I think that's what I've decided on. So perform start input logic. And let's make sure we change the name here, perform start input logic. The next thing that we need to do is go to the header file. So we can go to our baseplayercontroller.h, and we can come down here, and we need to set a variable which represents the class of our pause menu. We can do this with t subclass of, and the type we want here is going to be uUserWidget. So our pause menu is a child of uUserWidget, and so we know that the pause menu is going to be of type userWidget, so that or a child of it. So t subclass of uUserWidget means we can set the class to our pause menu class. And now we want to type pause menu class, a class of the pause menu widget. And we want to make sure that this is uProperty of edit. Let's do edit defaults only. We probably don't have to edit this on the fly with a blueprint read only because we don't need to write to it. We can set it in the defaults. We don't need it in the graph. And we can give it a category equal pause menu. And this means when we come in here and we press start, if this class has a value, then we can spawn it. So if pause menu class dot get default object parentheses. So basically, if we have a valid class, if we don't, it'll be null and this will return. But if we have a valid class for our pause menu, we can then spawn it. And to do that, we can type user widget pointer pause menu equals create widget, and we have to give it the type. You can give it user widget. It doesn't have to be as specific as the pause menu. But then we have parentheses after the angled brackets, and we want to have the owner of this widget, which is going to be this, the player controller. And then we need to know the specific subclass to spawn, which is going to be our pause menu class. This is going to spawn the pause menu. So we want to check if the pause menu is valid. So if pause menu, that means our widget was successfully created. And if it was, then we can add it to the screen by using pause menu add to viewport. And this will add it to the screen so we can see it. But before you can actually do this, you will need to update something in your SSB template.build.cs or project name.build.cs. That is because in this public dependency module names, you have a section where you can determine what modules or what dependencies you want to include in your game, specifically for C++. And in here, we don't have anything for our widgets. So if we comma after the last one and add UMG in here, we will get access to everything for UMG, Unreal Motion Graphics. So now I can go back to base player controller and all of this should build. Let's go ahead and try it. And I made a mistake with my base player controller, so of course I set a private variable to blueprint read only, which won't work because we won't be able to actually see that value. So we have a few options. We could make this public. We could change it to meta equals parentheses allow private access equals true, and this will allow it to be blueprint read only while being private. Let's try it again. And another thing, we want to make sure we include the file to be able to access this user widget and also the create widget function. So if we go back to the base player controller.cpp and go up to the top, and before our initial include here, we want to include blueprint/userWidget.h. Now that the editor is back open, we can go and make a blueprint base player controller. And the reason we want to do this is so that we can set our pause menu class that we set up in our code. So you can go to wherever you want to create this. I'm going to go to my functional BPs area, right click, add blueprint class. We're going to go to all classes and select our code class, which is base player controller. Then we'll call it base player controller BP. Open this blueprint up. And then we can go to the event graph. We can clear out any logic in here because we don't need it. Compile and save, and we can go to our class defaults, and we will have our pause menu class. Here is where we want to set this value, so we can just search for the widget that we want to spawn. It's going to be our pause menu. Even though the way we're setting up our pause menu is valid and we are going to use it, once we've made our base player controller BP, we also want to make sure we're using that base player controller BP. Now, the only place we use base player controller at all is in our base game mode blueprint. So we can go in there, we can go to the class defaults. We can make sure that the default player controller is our base player controller blueprint now, which is the same as our code class, just we have that pause menu class set on it. Then we can also search for our base player controller in all files. You'll see the only place that we're using it in the project is in the base game mode possess player, possess character. And at this point, we're spawning a base player controller. We want to spawn our base player controller BP. It's also worth noting that I have converted the Super Smash Brothers tutorial series from 5.0 to 5.1. Specifically, that is Unreal Engine 5.0 to Unreal Engine 5.1. This is not a required change. I was just consolidating some of my projects and versions, and I did this upgrade without any changes needed. I did not have to change a single thing. It just worked. I have episodes on upgrading projects if you need assistance with that. At this point, you can launch the game, test it by pressing your start input, which for me is the P key, and your menu should spawn. From there, you actually can utilize it, but we have a lot more we'll do with it in the future. As long as you can spawn it here, we are good for now. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode on how to create your pause menu within C++ and get it appearing on the screen. If you did, please subscribe and consider joining the Patreon, YouTube membership, and Discord subscriptions to help benefit myself and the channel and get rewarded along the way. I really appreciate it. If you had any problems following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to help you out, and that support is completely free. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.